Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death. Josef Mengele, often referred to as the Angel of Death, was one of the most infamous and reviled figures of the Nazi regime. His name has become synonymous with the atrocities committed in the concentration camps during World War II, particularly for the inhumane medical experiments he conducted on prisoners at Auschwitz. Mengele's story is a chilling reminder of how science, when warped by ideology and hatred, can become a tool of unimaginable cruelty. Born on March 16, 1911, in Günzburg, Germany, Josef Mengele grew up in a well-off Bavarian family. His father, Karl Mengele, was a successful businessman, and young Josef lived a relatively privileged life. He was academically gifted and displayed an early interest in anthropology, genetics, and medicine. In the 1930s, Mengele pursued his studies at prestigious German universities, where he earned a PhD in anthropology and a medical degree. Mengele's early academic career was shaped by the growing influence of the Nazi ideology of racial purity. He studied under some of Germany's most prominent scientists who advocated for eugenics, the idea that certain races and individuals were genetically superior to others. The belief in eugenics fueled Nazi policies of racial cleansing, and Mengele became deeply enmeshed in these ideas. He began to see himself as a scientist on a mission to purify the Aryan race by eliminating those deemed inferior. In 1937, Mengele joined the Nazi Party, and shortly after, he became a member of the Schutzstaffel SS, the paramilitary organization led by Heinrich Himmler. His career advanced rapidly within the SS due to his academic qualifications and commitment to Nazi ideology. When World War II broke out, Mengele served as a medical officer on the Eastern Front. He was wounded in action in 1942, which led to a reassignment that would place him at the epicenter of Nazi terror, Auschwitz. In May 1943, Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz, the largest and most notorious of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps. It was here that Mengele earned his infamous nickname, the Angel of Death. At Auschwitz, Mengele was not just a doctor. He was an executioner in a white coat, deciding who would live and who would die. He stood at the selection ramps where he inspected new arrivals. With a flick of his wrist, he determined whether prisoners were fit for forced labor or would be sent directly to the gas chambers. For many, Mengele's presence on the ramp was the final judgment, sealing their fate with cold indifference. But what made Mengele truly notorious was his obsession with medical experimentation. Under the guise of science, Mengele conducted brutal and often fatal experiments on the inmates of Auschwitz, with a particular focus on twins, people with disabilities, and individuals with unique physical traits. His experiments were aimed at furthering Nazi racial theories, particularly in understanding how to increase the birth rate of Aryans by learning how to produce twins. Mengele's fascination with twins led to some of the most horrifying practices carried out during the Holocaust. He would pull twins from the selection ramps, often telling them and their families that they were going to be given special treatment. But instead, these twins were subjected to appalling medical procedures. Mengele injected dyes into their eyes in an attempt to change their color, performed surgeries without anesthesia, and deliberately infected them with diseases to observe how their bodies would react. If one twin died, Mengele would often kill the other to conduct autopsies on both bodies, comparing their internal organs. Aside from twins, Mengele also experimented on people with physical deformities and disabilities, Romani people and pregnant women. His patients were nothing more than subjects to him, objects on which to test his twisted hypotheses. He once attempted to sew two twins together to create conjoined twins, resulting in horrific suffering and death. Mengele's experiments were conducted with a complete disregard for human life or dignity, often leaving victims in agonizing pain or causing their death. Mengele's actions were not just the result of blind obedience to the Nazi regime. He was driven by a deep sense of racial superiority and a personal belief in the power of science to engineer a better humanity. He saw himself as a scientist working for the greater good of the Aryan race, even if it meant inflicting unimaginable suffering on others. As the war drew to a close and the Allied forces began liberating concentration camps, Mengele fled Auschwitz in January 1945, narrowly escaping capture. He managed to blend in with other German soldiers, avoiding immediate prosecution as the Nazis were defeated. After the war, Mengele used forged documents to escape to South America, where he began a new life under a false identity. For decades, Josef Mengele lived in hiding, moving between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Despite international efforts to bring Nazi war criminals to justice, Mengele managed to evade capture, aided by a network of Nazi sympathizers and his own skill at remaining under the radar. During this time, he lived modestly, often working under assumed names and maintaining a low profile. While many of his fellow Nazi leaders were captured and faced trial at Nuremberg, Mengele remained one of the most wanted men in the world. The search for Mengele intensified in the 1960s and 1970s, with Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal tracking his movements and pushing for his capture. Despite the increasing pressure, Mengele managed to elude capture, dying in 1979 in Brazil after suffering a stroke while swimming. For years, his death remained unknown to the public, and it wasn't until 1985, when his remains were exhumed and identified through forensic testing, that the world learned of his fate. Mengele's story is one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of the Holocaust. He represents the perversion of science in the service of an evil ideology, where the pursuit of knowledge was twisted into a tool of genocide. Unlike many other Nazi figures who carried out their atrocities with a clear sense of duty, Mengele seemed to take a personal interest in his experiments, relishing the power he wielded over life and death. In the end, Mengele's legacy is one of pain, horror, and profound loss. His victims, many of whom were children, suffered unimaginable cruelty at his hands. The scientific value of his experiments was non-existent. His work was nothing more than pseudoscience rooted in hatred and racism. Yet his name endures as a symbol of the depths of human cruelty, a reminder of what happens when ideology and power are used to dehumanize and destroy.